Well, my hopes and expectations for the book are that it will present to both students and the average reader an account of these very important ideas in Irish history over a 200-year period. Basically, the as our interrelationship between violence, politics, and the attitude of the Catholic Church in trying to curtail, if you like, the violent propensities of its members. I begin with the 1798 rebellion in Ireland, staged by, in fact, the United Irishmen. And one of the aspects of that rebellion was the fact that a number of priests took part as rebels. And this was a source, of course, of immense embarrassment and frustration on the part of the Catholic authorities. One other aspect of the rebellion that's not normally kind of adverted to is the kind of religious ideology of Wolfe Tone, who's one of the leaders of the rebellion. Although from a Church of Ireland background, he was nevertheless a deist. And furthermore, he was very impressed by the fact that in the French Revolution of 1789, the Pope was burned in effigy in Paris. And so he began to think to himself that if that can happen among Catholic Parisians of the lower orders, then it can happen in Ireland. And if that does obtain in Ireland, then we can move to a point where, as he says himself, we can get rid of these categories of Catholic, Protestant, and dissenter, the dissenters being the Protestant nonconformists, members of the Presbyterian Church, and so on. We can move away from those categories and replace them with the common name of Irishmen and Irish women, though they didn't think too much of women in those days or about women in those days. But anyway, this was the idea, to get beyond kind of the sectarianism at the heart of Irish society. And so I tease out those themes throughout the whole of the book. Well, you ask about the famine, and the story of the famine is well known, of course, that in a kind of a 6-year period, about 1 million people died of starvation and disease, and as many as 1.5 million left the country, so that by the early 1850s, Ireland's population had been reduced by about 2.5 million. My concern is to examine specifically how people thought about the activity of God in the famine. After all, we're dealing with a highly religious culture. The vast majority of people are practicing Christians. 80% of them are Catholic. How do they regard the famine in relation to God? And there are different attitudes to this. Some, and we know this from folklore tales that are written down, some peasants regarded the famine as a punishment on them from God for having wasted food in times of plenty. And so God is punishing them in this way. Extreme Protestants took the view that because the government had decided in that very year, the very year that the famine broke out, 1845, because the government had decided to increase the grant to St. Patrick's College Maynooth, that was the Catholic seminary founded by the government in 1795, the government then in 1845 decides to increase the grant to St. Patrick's College Maynooth and to make it permanent. Extreme Protestants point to a correlation, as they see it, between the government supporting Catholicism, which they regarded as idolatrous, and ideas of the Pope as the Antichrist and all this kind of stuff. So they see a correlation between the government supporting St. Patrick's College Maynooth and the visitation of the famine, that this is clearly God punishing Protestant Britain for its support of Catholicism. And I then kind of try to tease those issues out, looking at them not only from the point of view of Protestant reactions, but also of Catholic reactions. And in some ways, perhaps one of the most astonishing aspects is the attitude of a man called Paul Cullen, who was at that time the rector of the Irish College in Rome. He would subsequently become, in 1850, the Archbishop of Armagh, and then in 1852, the Archbishop of Dublin, and would be made the first cardinal in Ireland in 1866. Writing to an Irish bishop in January of 1849, immediately after the year of revolutions in Europe, 1848, he's describing the situation of the Pope. Pius IX is forced out of Rome. He has to take refuge in the kingdom of Naples, in the town of Gaeta. And obviously he had to flee Rome with virtually only the clothes he was standing up in. So he's no money. And when he arrived in Gaeta, the Pope was forced to take refuge in a second-class hotel, very different from the sumptuous splendour that he was used to in Rome. Then Cullen, writing to an Irish bishop in January 1849, explaining all of this, what the Pope has had to suffer, he says that the rich Catholics of Spain and of France and of the Kingdom of Naples have rallied round to provide money for the Pope to enable him to live in a lifestyle to which he'd become accustomed. But then he says, nevertheless, Ireland, out of her poverty, must also contribute to the upkeep of the Vicar of Christ. This seems absolutely extraordinary. After all, the famine is still raging, and the concern of Cullen and other kind of officials in the papal household is that Ireland still has to provide some money to support the Pope. It's most extraordinary. Well, the question of Catholicism and Irish nationalism is one that has often troubled historians of Ireland. Did the Church facilitate the growth of nationalism? And in particular, did it facilitate the growth of extreme nationalism, separatist nationalism? I think that one has to say that although you can point to instances whereby the Church does support some of the great figures of Irish history, like O'Connell, for example, who was the liberator of Catholicism and achieves this great goal of Catholic emancipation in 1829. In general, it seems to me the Church was a bit wary of nationalism as a phenomenon and the growth of nationalism in Europe in the 19th century and into the 20th century. For the most part, the Church's concern was for its own position in Irish society. And if it could get all that it wanted from the union between Britain and Ireland, in other words, a recognition of its status in Irish society, if it could get things like Catholic education paid for by the state, if it could get a Catholic university paid for by the state, then it would be quite happy to remain part and parcel of the union between Britain and Ireland. In other words, the Church would play the card of loyalty to the Crown, loyalty to the government. The difficulty was this, that in a number of instances in the 19th century, the British government showed itself not disposed to Catholicism in general and Irish Catholicism in particular. And so this left the Church in a somewhat ambiguous or ambivalent position in terms of how it viewed the political union between the two countries. But for example, by the 1860s, Catholics, because they're now kind of better educated, some of them have acquired wealth and so on, they do begin to take their place, as the Church would say, their rightful place in Irish society. And so you have in 1868 the appointment of the first Lord Chancellor, the Catholic Lord Chancellor in Ireland, a man called O'Hagan. And the ecclesiastical authorities are over the moon about this, because at last, as they see it, as they think, they will be able to influence a Catholic who is in a prominent position in Irish society, and that is exactly what they want. And so therefore, they're less disposed to issues of nationalism, especially if that implies somehow separatism from Britain. And going into the 20th century, those ideas are still very much to the fore. Of course, what happens is the Rising, and this changes and transforms the whole climate of Irish nationalist opinion, and therefore the Church itself has to change its opinion. I do have a chapter on the activity of the Catholic Church in providing chaplains to the British forces in the First World War, and very many of these chaplains are, of course, from Ireland. The Rising in 1916, both immediately before the Rising and immediately after it, one of the preoccupations of bishops is to try to encourage Irish Catholic priests to volunteer as chaplains with the British Army fighting in France and in other parts of the world. This is the main preoccupation. But the fact of the Rising, the fact that the leaders are executed in the weeks afterwards, turns Irish public opinion away from support from Britain, away to some extent from support of Britain's war effort, and sets Irish public opinion in a more decidedly nationalist and separatist orientation and direction. The Church then has to begin to change its mind about these enormous issues. So if you see 1916 as a sort of seminal point in understanding contemporary Irish history or modern Irish history, one sees also the church beginning to amend its views to take into account the fact that public opinion has now swung in favour of rebellion, swung in favour of Sinn Féin. And by 1918, the forces of revolution, that is to say Sinn Féin and the Catholic Church, joined together to defeat the intention of Parliament and the British government to extend conscription to Ireland. That's the draft in American terms, because Ireland had been spared that. It had been introduced in Britain in January and May of 1916. Ireland was exempt from it. The government needs, by the spring of 1918, another 100,000 people, another 100,000 men to fight. So they look to Ireland and they try to force conscription upon Ireland, but the Church and the Party of Revolution defeat it. And then this gives rise to, of course, in the election of 1918, the triumph of Sinn Féin at the polls. And then immediately following this, one has the War of Independence. And therefore you see kind of bishops particularly as, how they regard themselves, the formators of public opinion, the various somersaults that they have to get involved in to try to keep ahead, shall we say, of the nationalist movement in Ireland. Yes.